Almost every scholar of the New Testament would agree that Paul existed and that Paul had a life-changing moment where he really thought he encountered Jesus alive after he was crucified on the cross. According to the report, Paul was en route to the city of Damascus. Suddenly, he saw a blinding light. Jesus spoke to him, and he was forever changed. But what if this experience is recorded not because a guy named Paul encountered the resurrected Jesus, but because a guy named Paul had a delusional experience which he merely thought was Jesus? The resurrection of Jesus is a bold claim, so it's good to look at other explanations that might be more sensible. That Paul had a delusion is one of those explanations, and it has some support. For instance, Paul's experience was different from those who were traveling with him, making it sound like his experience was something internal, in Paul's own mind. He also expressed having a bodily ailment or illness, and then proceeds to say that the church of Galatia once respected him so much, they would have torn their eyes and given them to him. Perhaps Paul's hyperbolic language about getting new eyes implies that his bodily ailment was something related to sight. We could postulate he wanted new eyes. In light of all this, an article in the Journal of Neurology diagnoses Paul with temporal lobe epilepsy, even pointing out that the attacks sometimes begin with a flash of light followed by an intense religious experience. If we apply this diagnosis to Paul's account experiencing the resurrected Jesus en route to Damascus, we run into some problems. Yes, the people traveling with him did not encounter Jesus as Paul did, but the text says they still experienced something. Acts 9 says that his companions heard a sound. Acts 22 says that his companions saw the light. The only difference is that they didn't see Jesus or connect with his words. The story tells of an external event that everyone experienced, although the most enlightening experience was granted for Paul alone. So we can't take the story to argue that it was an internal experience in the mind of Paul unless we scratch out the details of his companions. Acts 9 goes on to say that Paul's experience left him blind for 3 days, and then a guy named Ananias was instructed by God to visit Paul, pray for him, and at that moment Paul's eyesight was returned. So again, to diagnose this as an epileptic attack is to deny so many details of the story that I'm left wondering why you even used that story in the first place. Looking at Galatians, it's possible that Paul's condition involved his eyes, but even that would be highly speculative. Further, if we take for the sake of argument that Jesus really did resurrect and appeared to Paul in a blinding light, then we would expect that Paul's experience would look similar to someone who had a brain issue that could lead to a blinding light in a spiritual experience. Those who are biased against the resurrection have eliminated the possibility of Jesus already in their heads, making the delusion theory sound more probable. But as we've seen from the book of Acts, that theory doesn't entirely fit. Even if we suggest that the details of Paul's experience are off, there's a bigger issue. If Paul was aware of his condition, as advocates of this theory propose because of the verse in Galatians and elsewhere, then certainly after the experience of seeing Jesus, Paul would have come back to his senses and realized that it was just another episode of his condition. Remember, Paul consistently said that before experiencing Jesus, he was an enemy of Christianity. His whole life was invested in his status and power as a Jewish teacher, a Pharisee. Even if this was the first episode he ever had, he would have known that delusions sometimes happen in people, and his subsequent episodes would have caused him to realize that his first one on the road to Damascus wasn't real. A lot of atheists today, when asked if a vision of Jesus would change their mind, they say no, because they realize that delusions sometimes happen in people. Paul would have known this too. We may want to write off Paul's encounter with Jesus as a delusion. Paul would have wanted even more to write it off as a delusion, but instead, it was a life-changing experience. This indicates to me that Paul was not tripping on his trip to Damascus. I find it more reasonable to take Paul at his word and trust that he really encountered the resurrected Jesus. We might say that the author of Acts was lying about Paul's conversion, but of course we still have Paul's own words in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said that Jesus appeared to him. So if anyone was lying, it would have been Paul himself. However, I also find it quite unlikely that Paul was lying about his encounter with the resurrected Jesus. We'll talk about that next week. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.